Hello and welcome back, Egyptologists and archaeologists alike, and welcome back to the lands of Africa for today's video on the top 10 reasons why living in ancient Egypt was brutal. We're gonna start with how hippopotamuses love you too. One thing that many people don't realize is that the creature that kills the most people in Africa each year, quite literally their most dangerous creature on the continent, is not even a carnivore. It's the hippopotamus, as featured in that annoying Xmas song and that early 2000s Canadian commercial that had us all googling if house hippos are real. To really drill my point in, hippos are the only creature that actually ever scared Steve Irwin. Now, while they may not live on the Nile River anymore today, they certainly did back in the days of ancient Egypt and were sometimes considered a bad omen because of how dangerous they were. They could easily swamp boats, drag people under and drown them, and out of sheer aggression, they could maul people to death with their huge mouths and teeth even if they had no interest in eating them. As proven by King Tut and King Menes, who both got smoked by these animals while possibly out hunting them, which is something the upper class occasionally did. Call that immediate karma. But deadly creatures could be on a smaller physical scale. Rats and bugs. Most diseases that afflicted the ancient Egyptians, which they also happen to have very little protection from, were transferred by pests. Those who lived near the marshes used nets to protect themselves from the mosquitoes, netting around beds, doors, windows, you name it. They also had DIY pesticides for their homes, a solution of natron or dabid and debit, which is like a crushed charcoal. This mixed powder rub protected them from epidemics and vermin alike. The ancient Egyptians thought that the main reason for the pestilence of the year, which must be the prehistoric term's flu season, was the time of year when dryness and cracking of agricultural lands caused rats to surge up from it. It's also said that the papyrus Celiliaire III, that on the 12th day of the first month of winter every year is when disease season began. Obviously they made the connection: when you see rats, you've got fleas, and when you've got fleas, you've got plague. In ancient Egypt, the fee of bringing a doctor was very expensive. It could be a copper ingot, a set of vessels, or even, servitude women. This means that when the poor got sick, they would not be able to afford the doctor's fee, and as a result, life expectancy was no more than 35 years for the peasant, while the higher classes lived longer, reaching their 80s and 90s. So, how else do you conquer horrible bug? Why, by shaving every part of it. It was incredibly hot in ancient Egypt, and running showers only cameoed later in the dynasty. For this reason, finding ways to stay cool, stay hygienic, and also avoid awful pests like lice was very important. So, ancient Egyptians shaved their heads and the rest of their bodies clean, and we don't mean just the women either. Having smooth oiled legs, arms, and torsos became the Egyptian beauty standard for both sexes. Even for any women or people hearing this who know what it's like to shave more than the 4x4 inch face radius, it can be ridiculous to imagine the chore this must have been for everybody. Shaving your entire body regularly without modern razors, electric trimmers, wax, all while avoiding infection or scrapes on your skins with no water to help. This is where wigs come in. A lot of folks wonder how wigs have become so normalized in our world, and ancient Egyptians, really quite a few African continents, are the answer. They could be taken on and off, keep your head cool, and they can be tossed into a barrel to be soaked, cleaned, and deloused and worn again. And while I am on a horrible bug roll, worms. Anyone else in Canada forced to read that weird book in high school called The Troop with all those boys stuck on the island with the evil parasitic body infesting worms? No? Nobody? Alright, well, while I go to therapy for those nightmares until I'm like 108, let me plant a brainworm on you. Back in the days of ancient Egypt, they didn't have the kind of footwear choices we have today. Most people only had very basic sandals and shoes for their everyday work and travel, so foot problems were common, and there were ones that were more than just stepping on some shattered pottery or some burnt tootsies from hot sand. Wading into water for whatever, whether it's work, a bath, even just for fun, they had the risk of a schistosoma worm getting into their feet and then wreaking havoc on their internal organs, weakening the immune system. Or there's the Genea worm, which would hitch a ride in your nose or mouth, travel through your body and eat a path down your leg muscle and lay eggs in them as it goes. They could also get regular old hookworms as well, which could cause iron deficiency, anemia, and all kinds of other love symptoms. Perhaps they should have used some of that magic ancient technology and made more protective footwear, so I don't have to think about this for the rest of my night, but no. Okay, so that was awful. Instead of things that were consuming the ancient Egyptians, how about something they would consume? Sand. lots of sand. And dude, it effed their teeth right up. Many of our ancient Egyptian videos mention of the incredible innovations Egyptians had in regards to their teeth. They were known for being one of the earliest cultures to use both toothpaste and toothbrushes as well. But this can give the wrong impression. This wasn't a fun little vanity invention, but one of necessity. Sure, they practically had no sugar in their diet, let alone acids, but ancient Egyptians lived in an extremely sandy environment, as we all know. And since they didn't have the insulation and other vacuums and things we have today, the sand was pretty much everywhere in everything all the time. So yeah, ancient Egyptians were always getting grit in their food, especially their bread, which was the most common thing they ate. This, along with the regularly enjoyed beer, also full of sand, led to some really bad dental problems that they were constantly trying to find solutions for, such as their braces, tooth removal, infection care, and naturally toothbrush and toothpaste invention. And why not wash all that sand down with a whole lot of floodwater? Egyptians actually recorded, measured, and tracked the Nile River, and to do so they created their own series of measurements, the Nilometer, and a governmental cataloging system that could track the Nile patterns through the centuries of information, the Pharaoh stone. While the blessings of the Nile were many, there were such a thing as a little too much. Too high of a flood could destroy dikes, irrigation works, settlements, food stores, and livestock, increase epidemic diseases, and endanger seed stocks. Low or short floods didn't always reach some of the farmlands, which then as a result reduced the wetted area, the degree of soil saturation, and the amount of fertile silt deposited. But it would increase the salt concentration of the waters reaching the fields along the desert margins. This all reduced the cultivated area as well as the unit productivity, whether too wet, too dry, or too salty, and resulted in food crises ranging from food shortages to straight famine and plague. And naturally, the agriculture and fields were always the first affected by floods, which would immediately affect crop quality, its quantity, and thus income. Some theories mention that the decline after dynasty and at the end of the Old Kingdom occurred because of food shortages and famines resulting by the flow inundation. In the Tale of Two Brothers, when inundation confines the men and beasts within doors, the younger brother seats himself at the loom and weaves. Why? Well, this is my smooth segue into talking about how blue collar carried all, as it still does nowadays. Shout out to my blue collar workers, you're seen, essential, and loved. Anyways, to paint a picture, let me read a short segment of the instructions of Duakete, which dates back to the Middle Kingdom. The field hand cries out forever, his voice louder than the raven, his fingers have become ulcerous with an excess of stench. He is tired out in Delta labor, he is in tatters. He is well among lions, but his experience is painful. The forced labor then is tripled. If he comes back from the marshes there, he reaches his house worn out, for the forced labor has ruined him. This is just one of the many very fun literary resources that detail the haggard existence of the Egyptian blue-collared field. There was even an ancient Egyptian papyrus found, and it turns out it's a letter from a scribe of Amun-Ra listing reasons to his son why he should become a scribe and nothing else because everything else sucks. In describing the miserable life of a herdsman, it said that they were all worn out with constant toil, bad food, and the dank air of their habitat. Lived near marshes with his cattle. He had no settlement, home, a misery, lonely reed hut sheltered him at night and held all his worldly goods, a rush mat to sleep on, and clay water jar and basket for his head. Sometimes the Nile would flood as discussed and destroy a farmer's whole career. When summer came and the fish left, fishermen had to find new jobs. When drought arrived, artisans and clay makers had to shift focus. To survive, you had to be a master of all crafts, but with a limited education. Thank God you're only struggling to eat, fighting disease and climate disasters, all while getting taxed out the wazoo. So, biographies of the Middle Kingdom tombs shed light on the tax collecting activities of nomarchs. While an important administrative text, the Papyrus Brooklyn deals with the forced labor. From this we know until the first millennium BC, taxes were paid in the form of grain, cattle, and other commodities. The first coinage money is introduced in the 26th dynasty. Government officials regulated the yearly taxes, and the officials' main function was to ensure that the peasants paid their taxes either by persuasion or even by physical force. Taxes were not based on how much acre that had been produced that year. Remember all that Nile measuring? Surprise! Taxes were based off the result of inundation. Each year, the agricultural census officials were sent to measure the croppable area and gather a list of the institutions and private owners who held that land. This enabled them to estimate the year's crop and probable tax. Once the crops had begun to grow, other inspectors returned to make the final tax evaluation. Don't pay your taxes? Well, security will swing by with switches, a type of painful stick bundle, and punish you. There were many reasons for not paying taxes. The harvest or the tax itself is stolen from you, too low of a harvest, crop spoilage, and political instability. In the late late period, there was also another solution to pay tax or overdue loan, which means to sell yourself for labor. And what do you know, just like nowadays, unreasonable tax led to heavy corruption, aka royal profiteering, everyone's favorite, and Egypt was full of it. In the case of the whole erecting pyramids and 30-foot self-statues, if that wasn't distinctive enough. Following Hasheput's death in 1458, Egypt's only interest was profiteering, backed by the constant threat of violence. Nothing was done to create a sustainable system of provincial government. Instead, a teetering hierarchy of greed, nepotistic officials, and priests squabbled over positions and power. They memorialized themselves and advertised their family's greatness in corrupt expenditures, much like the prodigy houses of the Elizabethan England 3,000 years later. One such official was Rekhmire, vizier to Thutmose III and his son Amenhotep II. This swaggering bigwig, who literally wore a big wig to prove his status, built himself an extravagant memorial chapel at Thebes and a monument showcasing his status, paid out of the profits of the high office. Because internal theft was endemic, a consequence of staggering inequality pervasive in Egypt at the time. Of course, there's no point in judging a Bronze Era nation by the standards of today, but in Egypt, the gap steadily widened as the elite abused its power. Egypt's kings and high officials happily took from other nations and even each other, and kings defaced or demolished their predecessors' monuments, absorbing their achievements, and sometimes even helped themselves to rationalize grave robbing. And where there is corruption, there are spoiled Nepo babies. Many, well actually most of Egypt's kings pretty much popped out of the womb and were sat on the throne. The 18th dynasty is one of the most notorious for this, fathers seemingly dropping like flies and their young sons taking over. But despite literal children taking the throne, the system of divine myths surrounding the royal line was so embedded it allowed such young kings to rule unchallenged. War profits were mostly spent on conspicuous waste, but helped create an illusion of permanence. State vanity building projects were designed to glorify the regime as part of that mirage. Amenhotep III built a sprawling palace complex on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, with courts and pylons fronted by colossi depicting himself. At Karnak, Hasheput erected several obelisks honoring herself and Amun, her divine father. Khufu, son of Snerfu, decided to one-up his old man and commissioned the Great Pyramids of Giza, one of the last standing 7 wonders of the ancient world. Pepi II was only 6 years old when he became king of Egypt, and he behaved exactly as you would expect a 6-year-old to. An explorer told him that he had found a pygmy and he ordered the man to bring it to the palace so he could see for himself. His attitude never changed with age. He was the one who used to cover his servants in honey and make sure that the flies wouldn't bother him that way. And don't forget Ramses II, who was completely obsessed with making a name for himself, building multiple cities in his name, a museum called the Rasemium, and he would even quite literally scratch out the names of previous pharaohs and write his own on their accomplishments. The guy was so childish after horribly losing the battle of Kadesh to the Hittites and barely escaping with his life and being forced to sign a peace treaty, he had a massive mural commissioned showing his miraculous triumph. Alright, that's the end of another video. Thank you so much for tuning in and I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more from us, and until next time, if the pharaohs can take credit for each other's accomplishments, you can too. Stay toxic, everyone.